Lab has done a phenomenal amount of work looking at how we hit the broad middle of the energy efficiency market, particularly in the residential sector, looking at folks who are constrained by their income and also constrained by the public support programs that are available to them, but who represent such a huge portion of the housing stock and the activity in our economy. And so it makes it very important that all of us find ways to bring more relevant means for these middle-income homeowners to do energy efficiency projects. So we're very excited to have had Lawrence Berkeley National Lab do this work, this series of webinars, and publication of this report. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark Zimring at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab.
Great, thanks, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to highlight a couple upcoming webinars and meetings. We'll be hosting an in-person Middle Income Efficiency Forum for practitioners and policymakers in Baltimore, Maryland, on the front end of the ACI conference on March 26th. Registration is open to anybody that's interested. You can find that registration on our website at middleincome.lbl.gov. We'll also be hosting the last in our series of webinars on delivering efficiency to middle-income households, a policy-focused webinar on April 4th. And again, the registration link for that webinar is available on our website. A couple other notes before we dig in. These slides and audio will be available on our website in a few days' time. You can submit questions, which we'll take after all the presenters are finished, in the questions box on the right side of your screen. And again, the website at the bottom of this page has lots of resources, including links to past webinars and various publications and policy briefs that we've put out over the last couple months. So we have a wonderful set of presenters today, and I'm going to give a brief introductory presentation to frame today's discussion, and then we'll hear from Keith Canfield, who is the Communications and Energy Manager for the Clinton Climate Initiative's Home Energy Affordability Loan, also known as HEAL. As part of the Bill Clinton Foundation, CCI works to achieve greenhouse gas reduction through facilitating retrofits in commercial and residential buildings. Keith spent about 20 years in marketing and business development in the private sector, managing commercialization, marketing, and product launch activities in 23 countries. In recent years, Keith has concentrated on the application of energy efficiency to affordable housing in both post-disaster and conventional environments. At HEAL, Keith focuses on the development and implementation of sustainable energy rating and program engagement strategies designed to bring the benefits of efficiency to low and moderate income families at their workplace. Next, we'll hear from Jeff Pitkin, who's the treasurer of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, a position he's held since 2001. He's currently leading the effort to create financing structures to support loans for energy efficiency retrofits under the Green Jobs, Green New York program, including a residential on-bill financing pilot that launched in early 2012. And our last presenter is Adam Zimmerman, who manages CRAFT 3's energy efficiency lending program. CRAFT 3 is what was formerly known as Enterprise Cascadia. Adam works closely with a broad variety of public and private partners to deliver capital for energy efficiency projects throughout the Northwest. CRAFT 3 has delivered almost $15 million of capital to small-scale residential energy efficiency projects and contracting firms working in the field. So before we move on to today's presenters, I want to provide a brief overview of the findings from our recently published report on delivering energy efficiency to middle-income single-family households. First is, who are these households? For the purposes of the report, we define middle income as the middle third of U.S. households by income. Those generally who earn $32,000 to $72,000 a year. You can see that this definition overlaps various HUD low-income and very low-income definitions. And we think that the findings of the report likely apply to folks earning both above and below this somewhat arbitrary income definition. What we found was that the majority of middle-income households live in and own single-family homes. About 83% of middle-income households live in single-family homes, and 67% of middle-income households overall own their own homes or apartments. We also found that the majority of these households do not qualify for energy assistance programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program that offers free weatherizations to low-income households. So you can see that in all housing, middle-income households account for about 12% a third of middle-income households are eligible for weatherization. But that population that's eligible for weatherization is heavily concentrated in multifamily. In the world of single-family, the vast majority of middle-income households are eligible for the same incentives for energy efficiency programs as their higher-income peers. So just 6% of single-family households qualify for weatherization, compared to 36% of all middle-income households. As we move on to financing, once we've motivated households to want energy efficiency, we find that the upfront cost of home energy improvements is a significant barrier to investment. We found that energy upgrades for just a third of the 32 million single-family middle-income households would require an investment on the order of $30 to $100 billion, depending on the depth of those improvements. We also found that middle-income households have historically invested in maintaining and improving the value of their homes, but that the recession has brought about very fierce limitations in their capacity to invest. So while in 2001, 57% of middle-income home improvement projects were paid for in cash, the recession has since depleted those household savings. And when middle-income households turn to finance, they're more likely than any other income group to pay for home improvement projects using their home as a security. And I think we all know what's happened to the housing market during the recession. So what we've seen is that single-family home values have declined dramatically, down about a third since the housing market's peak. But that down by a third number actually masks more dramatic regional declines in housing values, and the concentration of these price declines in low and middle value properties. Those low tier and middle tier properties are those most likely to be owned by middle income Americans. So you can see that in places like Atlanta, overall property values are down by just about a quarter, but in the low tier properties, the loss of value more than doubles to about 55%. So again, middle income households have lost their cash savings, and when they didn't have cash, when they financed improvements, they relied more than any other group on home equity that has deteriorated during the recession. So at the same time that access to home secured financing has declined, we find that the largest energy efficiency loan programs that are offering unsecured loans are rejecting on the order of 20 to 50% of applicants. The largest programs are at the high end of that range, 40 to about 55%. And we also find that middle-income households in particular are rejected at higher rates than higher-income households. So you can see from this data from the Pennsylvania's Keystone Help program that less than 50% of applications for households earning less than 80% of area median income were approved, compared to their higher-income peers who were approved at a roughly 70% rate. There's reason for hope, though, in this chart, in that what we see is that about a quarter of the overall participants in Pennsylvania's program are relatively low income or middle income, sub 80% of AMI. So why is it that these households are rejected? Well, one reason is that credit scores, being a key metric for lenders in their creditworthiness evaluations, we see that middle income households have lower credit scores on average than their higher income peers. And I think what you'll hear consistently is that while credit scores do not explicitly take income into account, there's a clear correlation. So 650 credit score is generally seen as one of the lowest credit scores that you can finance using standard unsecured underwriting. You see that middle income households, our focus group, just 60% of them meet that credit score guideline relative to their wealthier peers or higher income peers, where 8 and 10 loan applicants meet that minimum credit score requirement. But credit scores are just one part of a fairly extensive loan underwriting process, and we find that debt-to-income ratios are actually responsible for more loan application rejections than credit scores. So we're going to hear from Jeff Picken about NYSERDA's residential energy efficiency loan programs and what they're doing to try to overcome this high rejection rate. but you can see that north of 40% of their loan application rejections were on debt-to-income ratios that were too high, whereas just a quarter of their loan rejections were because credit scores were too low. So it's clear that middle-income households need new ways of accessing affordable credit if they're to make home energy upgrades at scale. And we need them to make home energy upgrades because they're responsible for about a third of residential energy use. But it's also clear that underwriting criteria exist for a reason, and that's to make sure that those that get access to financing can and will repay it. And we need to take care with regard to who is given access to credit and what claims we're making about the benefits of energy improvements, particularly when today, while on average we may deliver energy savings and dollar savings on the back of that, there tends to be fairly significant variance in the performance of retrofits and the actual realization of dollar savings. And the reason I raise this is that if you look at the chart on at the bottom of the screen, there's a reason that folks have, a 650, let's say, cutoff for credit scores that they're willing to underwrite or tolerate, and that's that what you find is that the delinquency, the likelihood of delinquency more than doubles in the credit cohort from 600 to 649 versus the credit cohort from 650 to 699. So today we're going to hear from three really exciting panelists about a number of programs, but in general, the strategies that we think can be effective in serving middle-income households with capital are relatively robust credit enhancements that reduce lender risk and incentivize them to offer more accessible credit. Alternative underwriting that rather than providing capital to riskier households actually attempts to use alternative credit metrics to identify creditworthy households. And then lastly, innovative financing tools that may be better suited to serving middle-income households than traditional unsecured lending. So there's lots more information in our report, which again you can see at the link at the bottom of this slide. But with that, I'd like to move into our first presenter, Keith Canfield from the Clinton Climate Initiative.
Great, thank you. Nice to be with you this afternoon. Let me tell you just a little bit about what we call the Home Energy Affordability Loan, or also known as the HEAL program. Next slide, please. The Home Energy Affordability Loan is a Clinton Foundation program that's been under pilot here in Arkansas since about 2009. And the program was created to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by using energy efficiency as a business model that offers naturally a positive benefit to the employers that use the HEAL program as well as their employees. So I'd like to just take a brief minute to tell you about how the program works, and then we'll move on into the benefits for middle income. The program has a few variations, and I'll explain those in a moment, but generally works like this. The HEAL program works with interested employers to identify energy-saving opportunities in their business facilities. We'll even facilitate financing of those improvements to create energy savings, again, for that business. What we ask in return is that the employer use some of those savings to create a loan fund, loan vehicle, that will in turn finance energy upgrades in the homes of their employees. Next slide, please. We've developed the program to be kind of scalable and replicable, and the way it works is that HEAL provides really all the infrastructure that allows a company to offer this benefit, much like a 401k provider would do or a flexible spending account provider would do. So we'll come in and either provide or train for employee recruitment, sign-up, energy audits, management, employee consultation, again, all the way even into the upgrade process, so upgrade hand-holding, assistance, and QA. So again, it's all the way from recruiting the employee to sign up for the program through the audit and retrofit process and then QA. So again, it's a turnkey opportunity there. The reason we think employers are such a great platform for this is that they're natural aggregators. Large groups of employees are there. They're For the most part, most employers are thought of by their employees as being a credible source of information, and so these objectives really allow us to gain some scale by reaching out and dealing with the employer-employee relationship. And probably most importantly, we view them as a source of what we call credit-agnostic financing. And next slide, please. So what we mean by that credit-agnostic financing is that employers, when they form a lending or perform a lending role with their employees, don't look at risk in the traditional sense that you see from lenders. So what we find in the model of the employer providing that loan fund that I mentioned, what we see is that they look at that relationship with the employer on different risk metrics. And those are all risk metrics that are based around seniority, around the employment history they've had with that employee, around the last employee evaluation. But none of those metrics are, say, FICO-based or debt-to-income level-based or traditional risk management, financial risk management type of metrics. So, again, we think of that as being credit agnostic. They could really, in some cases, care less what the employee's credit relationship is. They're more concerned that they're a great employee and they want to use this program as a way to entice new employees and retain those that they have. I mentioned there were a couple of different flavors of the HEAL model. As we've been piloting this over the years, we've found that some employers, particularly state institutions, municipalities, many universities, higher education, have restrictions, statutory or otherwise, that do not allow them to offer employee loans. So we've come up with what we call a third-party finance, or HEAL 3, which uses the same type of system, but rather than the employer being that funder, that provider of the employee financing, that actually is taken on by a outside third party, and in all the cases that we've used so far, that's been a credit union. And although this moves away from strictly credit agnostic financing, we try to engage and employ some tools that would reduce the credit exposure. And the two that I mentioned here are a loan loss reserve, but also what we call a bridge fund. And the bridge fund comes into place, for example, when there are rebates that are going to accrue to a given client. Let's say it's a $1,500 retrofit, and $1,000 of that retrofit cost is going to come back in rebate. Will you employ the bridge loan so that, in essence, they're only having to qualify for credit for that $500 net cost? So although we don't escape, again, credit finance risk entirely by shrinking the exposure, it's much more palatable usually for the outside lender and a much more manageable opportunity for finance. So again, both these models, the traditional model where the employer provides the loan and the third-party loan provision, both of them use payroll deductions at the workplace to repay those loans. And I'd also like to say, it's credit agnostic in the sense, both of them are credit agnostic in the sense that they don't require any valuation, home valuation or equity valuation. It is really and strictly a question of employee stability and risk from the employment standpoint. Next slide, please. What we see, though, as we roll this out, and again, we're always looking for new replication partners, I should mention, to try this in other parts of the country and in other situations. And what we've found as we've implemented this, the third-party financing model, is even with the threat of a credit evaluation of some sort, even a lessened one, we see that really changes the dynamic of the financing process. So we're in the situations where we see the employer offer the loan, where there's really no qualification other than some minimum employment levels and a positive employee evaluation. We moved from an 85% rate of providing that loan by the employee to a much lower percentage when they have to go outside and qualify to even minimum qualifications for a credit union or such. So we definitely see that just the threat or the hint of a credit-based decision significantly impact the numbers and the way that people access the program. Next slide, please. The other big influencer we see in the middle-income homeowners particularly is how and in what manner rebates are determined. You can see there's two examples here, kind of our overall experience with several different pilots of the HEAL model versus one that was our sixth pilot there. You can see I've highlighted duct sealing. You can there's a more than doubling of the implementations of duct sealing in there. That was strictly due to a change in the rebate calculations. We had a natural gas provider that came into the program, so it wasn't quite a doubling of rebate, but it was a significant increase. So you can see that there's a huge response differential. So we've been testing kind of those responses a little bit. Don't have statistically significant data to share with you yet, but some really interesting numbers can be pushed around by relatively modest changes in rebate calculations. The other thing we found is that when comparing 0% financing to the rebate side, there's a huge difference in the uptake for those, so that we find unquestionably the thing to move folks into that retrofit arena seems to be the rebate side rather than 0% financing. Next slide, please. Lastly, I just wanted to kind of quickly show one of our case studies and to point out that there's a lot of information there, but to point out two things. One, if you look in the total cost column over there, the rebate cost was about $1,800, and this was a great one with a few stacked rebates, but in essence, $1,500 of that $1,836 came back. But probably even more importantly is the annual utility savings estimate over there. Again, what we find with our business partners is that it's been a really challenging environment for them to offer raises and increases over the last few years. So in essence, for this employee who makes less than $50,000 a year, they were able, through this program, to offer what is an after-tax raise, if you want to think about it, increase in disposable income of 2 or 3%, depending on the tax bracket there. So it was a great way for employers to really offer a raise in what has been a very constrained economic environment. So again, we think it's a great benefit for the employer, and it's a great benefit for the employee. Next slide, I think that's it.
Great. Thanks very much, Keith. One quick question. Can you just speak to the average loan size and any potential challenges that you're seeing with credit union partners in originating kind of low dollar amount loans?
Yes, it's an excellent question. The average that we're seeing along all of our programs is somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 for the rebate side. I mean, I'm sorry, for the retrofit side. So it's the low-hanging fruit type of retrofit, and we have had some pushback from credit unions on transaction size when you really get down to a small amount like the $500 example I had there. So generally not worth their while. So that it does cost some uptake percentage for those candidates that would have a small amount on those credit union side. Of course, you don't have that restriction on the employer side.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Just a reminder to the audience, you can submit questions into the questions box on the right side of your screen. There are a bunch coming through, and have faith we will get to these questions after the other presenters have finished presenting. So with that, I would like to transition to Jeff Pitkin, Treasurer at NYSERDA.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jeff Pitkin, Treasurer at NYSERDA. Mark, can I go to the next slide? I'm going to speak to our implementation of our Green Jobs, Green New York program that Mark mentioned earlier. Green Jobs, Green New York was legislation enacted in 2009 that was the result of a very strong stakeholder and advocacy effort that looked to build off of NYSERDA's current residential efficiency programs. We were an early pioneer of the Home Performance with Energy Star program. We've been operating it here in New York for over a decade now. We're doing about 6,000 or 7,000 retrofits a year, and we've done 50 to 60,000 homes across the state of New York, which sounds impressive until one recognizes or realizes the number of housing stock that we have here in New York. And so I think it's a testament to the fact that there still are considerable untapped opportunities. And so this legislation that was enacted in 2009 looked to require NYSERDA to establish a revolving loan fund and to offer innovative financing mechanisms in an effort to try to encourage energy efficiency improvements in residential homes, small businesses and not-for-profit organizations, and in multifamily buildings. But it wasn't just a financing program. Importantly, it had very strong elements built in to require consumer engagement through constituency-based organizations and integrated workforce development programs. And so it's a comprehensive program that's offering financing, worker training, and consumer outreach efforts. The residential component of that program was launched at the very end of 2010 with a direct unsecured loan product that we offered. In August of 2011, the program was modified through legislation that established an on-bill recovery financing program, which was offered on a statewide basis through the 6 investor-owned utility companies and the Long Island Power Authority. The on-bill charge is a tariffed utility charge, meaning that it is subject to termination of service for failure to pay, but at the same time also comes with the normal consumer safeguards that are embedded into the utility billing process. So it does require deferred payment arrangements to be offered prior to consumers having service terminated. An important element of the legislation was the requirement to provide for a transferability of the obligation so that we could overcome one of the historic impediments to residential efficiency improvements, in that oftentimes these projects have a longer repayment period than is the average home ownership. And so the legislation provides that unless the on-bill recovery obligation is satisfied prior to the sale of a property, then it becomes the responsibility through a charge in the purchaser's utility account. The seller of a property has to provide notice to a purchaser, and the legislation required the filing of a mortgage, not as a means of providing credit support to the loan, but rather to ensure that a purchaser of a property would be provided notice of the existence of the on-bill obligation. When we launched this program at the end of January, we ran into some issues with the use of the mortgage, and so there's a current legislative amendment that has been introduced which would replace the mortgage with a declaration. A declaration is something that's often used to file things like property easements. So the idea here is we're not placing a lien on the property, we're not interfering with the current mortgage or the future mortgage of the property, but we are providing a means to ensure that any subsequent purchaser is notified of the existence of the obligation. The on-bill legislation requires that the annual repayment amount that the consumer undertakes can't exceed the estimated annual energy savings. And so that was an important element built into the legislation to provide assurance that the consumers would realize savings in their bills. Also an important element to win the support of the utility companies was to build in a mechanism to help them fund upgrades to their billing systems in order to accommodate on-bill. And so the legislation had a fee mechanism built into it where for each loan that is undertaken in each utility company, we're providing a $100 payment to the utility That's an offset to their billing system revisions, and also a separate fee of 1% of the amount of each loan, which helps them to offset their administrative costs. And another important element was agreeing to a subordination of utility charges. So if a consumer does not pay their bill in full, then the payments that they make are first applied towards their utility charges and then secondarily to the on-bill installment charges. The legislation required that the on-bill program would commence on May the 30th, but Governor Cuomo announced in his State of the State message in early January that the program implementation was being accelerated. And so we launched the program for residential homeowners on January the 30th. And we used an approach, given that the legislation allowed for the utilities to have until the end of May to complete their system changes, we used kind of a normal marketing gimmick of no payments until June. And so we are allowing consumers to take advantage of the financing, but their collections will not start on their utility accounts until June. Next slide, please. The Green Jobs Green New York legislation provided $112 million in funding out of our Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction allowance proceeds, and of that, about $51 million was used to seed the initial revolving loan fund that is used to fund loans. The balance of the funding is used for subsidies for energy audits and workforce development and outreach activities as shown. We also were the recipient of a grant from the Department of Energy through their Better Buildings program, of which NYSERDA's share is about $18.6 million, and we have allocated $9.3 million of that to serve as a loan loss reserve to help us leverage private capital. So our structure, which I'll speak to in a moment, is to use these funds in the revolving loan fund and the DOE grant funds to help leverage capital through the secondary markets. We also used a small portion of the DOE grant to help fund some of the utility billing system upgrades. Next slide, please. This slide is a summary of the roles of the different entities involved in the Green Jobs Green New York program. NYSERDA is the overall administrator of the program, and we're also the capital provider. Our utility partners are responsible for collecting on-bill recovery loan installments. We currently have one single statewide entity who is doing the loan origination. That's Energy Finance Solutions. It's a Fannie Mae lender. We expect to open the program up to have multiple lenders participate in the program during this current year. The loans are originated using NYSERDA's loan underwriting standards, which I'll summarize in a moment. The lender then closes on the loan, and currently the loan is purchased by NYSERDA, and for that the lender earns an origination fee. We also have a master loan servicer, Concord Servicing Corporation, who's a third-party loan servicer. Concord is responsible for performing billing and collection services with regard to our direct unsecured loan, and they are also responsible for the data file transfers with the utility companies to support the on-bill recovery loans. In addition, the master loan servicer monitors the loan origination function on a sample basis to ensure that the loan originator is issuing loans that conform to our standards. And then the last piece of our puzzle is we have an entity who is performing the property ownership searches and recording mortgages and declarations to support on-bill. Next slide, please. So the loan underwriting standards that we're using in the Green Jobs Green New York program is to support two different tiers of loan. The first is homeowners who can meet a traditional standard that's accepted in the capital markets, a Fannie Mae standard. We expect these loans will be aggregated and then financed through the capital markets. And since we're using standards and criteria that are well supported by the capital markets, we expect these loans to be able to be supported through a secondary markets offering. However, the legislation called for NYSERDA to broaden access to financing to those consumers who may not traditionally have access to financing. And so we created a second tier of loans where we could use alternate criteria such as utility bill payment history or mortgage payment history as a substitute for FICO standards. The idea here is that we will hold these loans in our revolving loan fund. We'll monitor their performance for a period of time, 2 or 3 years, and then if the performance of these loans is as we expect it to be, we hope to include these loans as part of our secondary markets, capital markets financing. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a summary of the loan underwriting standards that we use for Tier 1 and Tier 2. And these standards apply regardless of whether the consumer is applying for an on-bill recovery loan or whether they're applying for a direct unsecured loan. So you can see the first tier requires a FICO score of 640 or higher, whereas the second tier, Tier 2, looks at utility bill payment history and mortgage payment history as an alternate. The program does also look at debt-to-income ratios. As Mark mentioned, 50% is a very customary cutoff point for debt-to-income. But our Tier 2 loans allow for more relaxed criteria and allow us to approve consumers who have up to 70% debt-to-income. There are also relaxed standards for consumers who might have had a prior bankruptcy. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a quick summary of the loan terms for our two loans that we're offering residential homeowners. Again, the unsecured loan, the on-bill recovery loan, the loan amounts, the underlying program and energy efficiency financing criteria are the same for both. The interest rate is slightly lower for on-bill because ultimately the on-bill recovery program and the statute provides for a higher degree of certainty in terms of our capital markets execution. I'll speak to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So our capital markets financing approach, as I mentioned earlier, is to initially fund loans out of the revolving loan fund, to aggregate them, and then for NYSERDA to issue bonds in the capital markets where we would pledge the underlying cash flows from the loan portfolio to support the bond issuance. We're working on a master trust structure. We expect this to be a rated security that will sell into the markets. And through some initial discussions that we've had with our underwriting team, we actually are quite hopeful that the on-bill recovery structure will actually qualify for a AAA rating, which is the cheapest money that we can get through the secondary markets. And so we're very hopeful that that the use of the on-bill structure can lead to a reduction in our cost of capital. Our initial bonds that we will issue will be issued as qualified energy conservation bonds, or QECBs. These bonds carry a 70% federal subsidy, so the federal government is in essence reimbursing us for 70% of the interest costs on the bonds. And as a result of that, it dramatically lowers our net costs of financing, and we pass that along to the consumers in the form of the lower interest rates. However, the bonds require the use of bond volume cap, which is limited in amount, and so once we exhaust this bond volume cap, then the loans on the interest rates on the loans would need to be increased, because at that time the cost of funds would no longer be subsidized to the federal government. Next slide, please. So the next couple slides are status of where we are with the program. So for our unsecured loan product, again, we launched in November of 2010. We have about 1,400 loans in process for about $13 million in capital. The on-bill recovery loans, as I mentioned, were launched at the end of January, so we've received 105 applications. We've seen limited uptake currently. In the first month of the program, about 60% of the applications from consumers came through for on-bill, but much of that was limited to the fact that we were requiring the mortgage filing, and I think we're hopeful that when the legislation that has been introduced is enacted, that some of those restrictions will go away, and the consumer uptake on on-bill will be much improved. But I also note here in this slide the approval rate for financing, and as Mark mentioned earlier, you know, the standards that are used to approve consumers' financing has a dramatic impact. And I think our results here in our program over the last year or so coincide with some of the figures that Mark had in his earlier slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of breaking out our loan portfolio between loans that have been approved under our Tier 1 standards and the alternate Tier 2 standards. So the good news here is that about 7% of our total loan portfolio has been loans approved for consumers who would not have qualified for financing under traditional means, but we have been able to qualify them using this alternate criteria. Next slide, please. And this is just a summary of the delinquency rates for our current portfolio. I would quickly note that this is a very short amount of time for the loans that we've issued to date, and so I don't think this is conclusive evidence of what we expect the long-term performance of the loans in the portfolio to be. But we're going to continue to monitor the performance, the relative performance of these two portfolios, and we look to continue to make adjustments to our loan underwriting standards to support broadening access to financing as much as we reasonably can. Next slide, please. Oh, Mark, you had...
hey, Jeff, yeah, I was just going to ask you to present this last slide before, before you close up. Thanks.
Okay. So this last slide is our Home Performance with Energy Star program does provide incentives to the homeowners in addition to providing financing. And for consumers whose income falls between 60% and 80% of area median income. So these are consumers who are above weatherization assistance eligibility but below the higher income thresholds that Mark referred to earlier. Our program provides a 50% subsidy. That is, it underwrites the cost of the energy efficiency improvements by 50%, but then those consumers are able to access financing. And so with that, their cash flow situation is dramatically improved. And we believe that the ability of these consumers then to repay these obligations is likewise greatly improved. And so what this chart shows you is overall about 24% of our consumers who are taking advantage of the program financing are receiving this assisted home performance with Energy Star subsidy that provides a 50% subsidy in addition to providing the financing. And that's my last slide. Be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Great, Jeff. Thanks very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I think we'll move on to Adam Zimmerman, and then there are a number of questions that have come through for you that we'll address in the Q&A. Just to remind everybody, you can submit questions in the question box on the right side of your screen. Adam, are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Then I am here.
Great. Okay, why don't you get started?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Zimmerman. I am an Executive Vice President at Craft 3 out in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. Jeff did a great job. Wonderful data. I'm really impressed by what they're doing in New York and envious of what a bigger state can do in terms of resources and legislation. So I really am pleased that they're going down this path. I think what you'll find is that the work that we are doing in Oregon and to some extent Washington is very close to what Jeff described. And so I'll try to be fairly brief. Next slide. Just so everyone knows, so Craft 3 is a community development financial institution. We're a nonprofit. We're about 17 years old, and we serve Oregon and Washington. And we are, by and large, an organization that seeks to extend credit to those that historically have trouble accessing it, either businesses or markets and consumers. And we apply our approach with a triple bottom line type of lens. So we're consistently looking at what are the economic development impacts of our investing, what are the environmental impacts in our investing, and what are the equity impacts of our investing, and equity in terms of providing access to credit for those who struggle to, or historically have struggled to get to it. Next slide. Go ahead, Mark. Just a picture of our balance sheet so folks understand how a community development financial institution is capitalized. Our organization our portfolio and our liquidity is essentially an aggregate of a bunch of different sources that range from regulated depository banks, Bank of America, pretty much any of the large banks that you can think of are on our balance sheet as creditors, to foundations, the federal government, and individuals. So we sort of put together a pile of capital that's aligned with our mission and seek to deliver it in ways that either serve the edges of a market, meaning new areas that traditionally don't get any financing, or the margins of a market, which is areas that have people are getting financing, but there are certain segments that are consistently left out. Next slide. So we do both business and commercial lending and consumer lending, and most of what we're going to talk about today is consumer lending. And we deal in both energy efficiency and water quality. So we're also doing similar loans for people whose septic systems have failed. Next slide. And finally, I just wanted to give this group a sample of the kind of things that we pay attention to when we do investing. So you'll see through this matrix that there are 9 different types of things that we measure when we're making an investment in a property or a business. And we treat this very seriously, and every year we look to expand our outcomes here. And this will come up in a couple slides. Go ahead, Mark. Next slide. So very briefly, our single-family residential loan product, which is primarily delivered in Oregon, is structured on a couple of different conditions. One is that we are very much after energy reduction as a source of cash flow in a household. So the way that we have structured our programs is that they shoot for providing financing for the lowest hanging fruit first. And I think the gentleman from the Clinton Foundation noted this earlier as well, is that we're really after insulation and air sealing to be followed by mechanical improvements around HVAC and water heating. We're not so much in the business of solar or windows or appliances at this point, because the return on investment in terms of savings is low. We are very much seeking a low-touch underwriting process. Craft 3 does all the underwriting and the servicing for our loans. We first and foremost look at loan applicants' utility payment histories. So we have a relationship similar to NYSERDA with the utilities in our service area. They both provide us with applicants' histories on utility payment, and then if a loan actually proceeds to closing and disbursement, then the utility agrees to collect the principal and interest payments via the utility bill. What we believe this has allowed us to do is really put a heavier weight on how someone pays their utility bill. And that's not always directly correlated with someone's credit score. So, for example, if we look at 12 months of utility payment history, we're really looking at a string of 2 to 3 mistakes or late payments on the utility history in order to determine whether or not we think this person is going to continue to pay their utility bill on time after they've had this the retrofit work done. And to be clear, I love the NYSERDA approach with looking at the estimated energy savings and the associated cash flow and sizing the cap of the loan payment to that. I wish we could do that here, but I will say in mild climates like the Northwest, it's really difficult to get this work done and still deliver payments that are in line with annual energy savings. And that's just simply because our energy is too cheap and our climate is too warm. We have spent a substantial amount of time with our 3 IOU utilities in Oregon trying to develop a series of IT connections between our servicing platform and their billing and collections platform. This allows us to get real-time information from the utilities on how our customers are doing in repaying their principal and interest payments to the utility. And the utility ultimately remits those payments to us and I'm happy to answer more questions about that relationship if people have them. Very quickly, product specifications. All of our loans right now go out the door at 5.99%. When we started, we had offered a set of tiered rates depending on savings levels and income. We changed to just 5.99 about a year ago, and frankly, haven't had really any pushback on the customer side. I will say that lower interest rates are nice to be able to offer. Certainly, they attract customers. One of our challenges, however, is that our structure, our institutional structure, has a pretty constrained liquidity access. We're not a depository institution. So we're really looking to aggregate a portfolio that will attract some investors. And we are very sensitive to dropping our rate at all. And those who have been tracking this for a while will know that 6%, a portfolio that's earning 6% or thereabouts is barely enough to get a pulse out of the institutional investing community. So we've landed on 5.99. We think there's probably some flexibility in the market out here to go a little bit higher. We would really resist lower. The term on our loans is 20 years. That is probably worth being flexible down to 15. The point of the long term here is, again, sort of related back to the cash flow and energy savings that we see in the Northwest. It's just very hard to get very quick payback out here because of the energy prices and climate. We do file a mortgage on all of our on the homes for all of our borrowers. It's essentially a blind lien. It's subordinated to everything else that might be on title. We do that so we can have a fingerprint on the title, so that when it goes into title change, we have access to the title company who will inform us that a sale or a title change is happening. And we will, at that point, have a conversation with our borrower around whether or not they want to pay off the loan, or we do reserve the capacity to transfer the loan to the next owner. But we have historically really discouraged that. We would like to see the, say, conventional mortgage market working with assessors, understand that an energy efficiency retrofit adds to the value of the property, and to build that into the price of a sale. And frankly, for our purposes, the mortgage market in the U.S. Will always offer pricing for money that is favorable to the kind of pricing that we can offer. Again, we service these through the utility bill. It's basically a conduit for repayment. The utility does not share the risk of default. They simply collect the payment and remit them to us and report who didn't pay. We pay a small fee to them for that. And the repayment system does follow the utility that provides the heat for the structure. So the understanding being that most of the savings for the type of retrofits we're doing are realized on the heating bill and not on the electric bill. In most cases, they're gas homes. Although electric heat pumps are becoming more and more popular out here. We do have a cash-funded loan loss reserve for this program of 10%. We are continuing to maintain that, and hopefully we'll be able to reduce that over time as we understand the demands of the investment market. And again, the goal is to really keep the impact on the family budget low, but it's hard to get to what we would call out here net neutral, given the sort of landscape here. Okay, Mark, go ahead and go to the next slide. This has been our philosophy in terms of building this market. We work closely with Clean Energy Works Oregon, which is a Better Buildings funded nonprofit that is charged essentially with shifting the residential energy market to a different kind of environment, where it's much easier to essentially walk into a one-stop shop and choose a package and get the work done and get it done with confidence, get it done with built-in rebates, and get it done with financing that is affordable. And we're very much aware that the value proposition is convenience, ease, and comfort. People, by and large, glaze over when you start talking about BPI certifications and all of the things that the home performance industry knows so well. That Clean Energy Works Oregon, in collaboration with Craft 3, we're really trying to offer something that's simple, clear, and easy to do. Go ahead, Mark. Next slide. This is a profile of a Clean Energy Works Oregon customer. I won't read it verbatim. I wanted to draw attention, though, when we start talking about outcomes. You know, both Craft 3 and Clean Energy Works Oregon are very interested in these larger outcomes for providing financing. So not only does an investment by a homeowner in a retrofit deliver energy savings, it also delivers jobs in the local workforce. And through the structure of the program has embedded ways for emerging contractors, both minority and women-owned businesses, to access the jobs that are coming through the pipeline, as well as providing additional assistance to low-income families through the kind of credit structure we have. And I will take this moment to say that we do not conduct a debt-to-income ratio analysis, which I think Mark noted at the outset is one of the primary reasons that people are getting declined for applications. We want to be more inclusive rather than less inclusive, and given the economy right now, it's sometimes tough for debt-to-income ratios to make sense along traditional lending lines. But also, it's a lot of work to collect the data necessary to conduct the debt-to-income ratio, and it slows down the process, slows down the approval in general. So we really tried to avoid it because we don't think it's actually terribly germane if we find that the utility payment history is good and the energy savings are robust. Next slide. So just quickly, in terms of outputs, we've been doing this for about 3 years. So you see we're just under 1,300 homes retrofitted, and those are all loans. Just under 16 million in homes in loans originated. Our return on investment is not quite 6. As I mentioned, we had a number of different types of rates early on before normalizing. There are a large number now of independent businesses involved in this program, all of which are finding work. And the last one, I'll explain a little bit. Criticized assets. You know, we have 1,300 loans out the door, but our average age of loan is still under a year. So we're early on in this process in terms of portfolio performance. That said, we to date have written off 2 loans, and that our what we call our criticized asset level ranges between 3 and 4% on a given month. And those are not loans that are necessarily going to be defaulted. Those are all of the loans in our portfolio that we are keeping special watch on because they have missed a payment and are falling behind. A few of those are approaching default, but the vast majority of them are simply slightly off track. And so we spend a lot of time making sure people get back on track. And I will say that one of our lessons learned from portfolio servicing has been that usually what happens is we find a borrower hits a bump, we give them a little nudge, and they get right back on track. If our nudge fails, it's pretty certain that they're going all the way down to write-off. There's pretty much not sort of an interim stage where someone gets fairly far behind and then recovers. It's usually a little bit behind and fixed, or they're circling the drain. Next slide. And just to close here, you know, again, we care a lot about outcomes, and this speaks a little bit to this question of middle-income households. Half of our portfolio is less than the median household income for a family of 4, which in Portland Metro is $73,000 a year. So while our credit scores, which is not on here, are still quite high, we only have about 2% of the portfolio that have credit scores under 650, and we'll go down as low as 590. That said, there are a number of other issues that compromise folks' credit, as well as including income and debt-to-income ratios in traditional sense. We feel like we're trying to match, in terms of diversity, the profile of the communities that we're in, and we think we're getting close to that. CDFI tracts is our proxy for low-income tracts, and we're pretty proud that a lot of these investments are going into lower-income neighborhoods. And then the last one on their subordinated debt on the left is really about, you know, an acknowledgement that we are behind the mortgage market in terms of our position on title, and we think that's a good thing. Next slide. I think this is it. One more. So as I mentioned at the outset, Oregon is a small state compared with New York. It's challenging to get access to liquidity for a program like this. We're very much interested in building a large enough portfolio to attract investors, have been involved in some of the same kind of thinking that Jeff's folks are doing around bonds, around qualified energy conservation bonds. How do we build something that equals liquidity for at least another round of doing this? And you see the challenges are all the things that I've suggested: price point, portfolio performance, our underwriting process, the length of our maturities, and the general reticence to invest in new stuff given the economy. But you know, we find that we think in order to get liquidity, we've got to find investors that not only value the return, but are also looking at some of the other outcomes that I've tried to articulate here to motivate their investment. I think that's it. Thanks, Mark.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Adam. That was wonderful. Oh, we're getting some feedback. Hang on one second. Folks, please submit your questions into the questions box on the right side of your screen. It seems like we've resolved some of these feedback issues. Contact information for all the panelists is at the bottom of the screen here, and again, resources. A number of resources are available on our website. So let's dive into the questions. The first two are for Keith. Question about how folks might go about participating in the Clinton Foundation's sponsored HEAL program. What are the first steps for employers or employees to take to potentially be part of this pilot?
Well, the first step is it does have to come through the employer. So that's really where we start our engagement, is with an employer, and we are looking for replication partners. So you know, all around the country and in different industries. So by all means, please shoot me an email at the email address that's on the screen there, and I'll pass it on to my boss, Martha Jane, who I'm sitting in for today. She's sick. And it all starts there. So if you're an employer that is interested in the program, by all means, please let us know. And every model we've seen so far is slightly different. So it is a highly customized model, and we'll be happy to tell you the best way to kind of consider whether you're a good candidate for that or not.
Great. Thanks, Keith. So the next question, again for you, Keith, is from Julie Hughes, and I guess with a caveat given the customization you just mentioned, but it'd be great to know what specific criteria employers financing the HEAL program are actually looking at. That is, you know, what are the specific criteria or thresholds around seniority, employment history, that type of thing. And have you assembled a big enough loan portfolio to date to know whether these are good predictors of loan performance or non-default?
Well, sure. I can give you some kind of rules of thumb a little bit, with that caveat that you just mentioned, Mark, that everyone's different. But what we've seen, we try to engage with the HR department of an employer and really ask a couple of questions about their own objectives and the program. And one of the key determinants that helps them kind of quantify their risk is what their employee life cycle looks like. I mean, do they see a lot of, on new employees, they see a lot of turnover in the first 6 months, as we've seen with some like manufacturing operations where folks decide they just can't hack it on the line? Or is it a more extended turnover rate? There's usually somewhere in there's a tipping point, and we've seen it as little as 6 months, and we've seen some in the hospitality industry where they seem to drop out after about 2 years. So we help engage in that analysis process because, again, we want them to be able to quantify their risk properly. And so far, I'd like to say that the results have been pretty amazing. Is that we're experiencing, or the employers are experiencing, almost zero defaults. So we have had situations where employees have left before their loan's been exhausted, but they have worked that out with the employer. So it's very encouraging from a risk management standpoint. And again, since it's funded with energy savings, it's almost a no-cost benefit program over time, which, of course, what industry doesn't get attracted by that these days?
Great. Thanks, Keith. A few of the webinar attendees have a series of questions, I guess, for Jeff and Adam about the process that you've gone through to design these on-bill programs, how much time it's taken from conception to implementation, who the key players were, how utilities kind of responded and what it took to get them on board, and any advice that the two of you have for folks considering pushing for on-bill in their respective regions or states. So maybe Jeff.
A comes before J. So Adam, you want to go first?
Oh, fine. I was thinking you were going to go first. So briefly, a couple things. So first of all, it's good to understand that in Oregon, there is a centralized repository for utility public purpose charges from IOUs. It's called the Energy Trust of Oregon. So what that means is that the three major investor-owned utilities in Oregon provide funding to a single nonprofit, and that nonprofit is charged with conservation and development of renewables. It also holds a table where all three of those utilities come to work on programs. And so that really has provided a way to talk to the utilities about this at a single table. And that, I think, can't be underestimated. And second, I would say that, whether it's because of the Energy Trust or whether it's just kind of the way it is in Oregon, the utilities have all been fairly amenable to this conversation. And initially, they were skeptical that this could work. I think some of them had tried versions of this in the past, maybe self-administered, and they hadn't gone really well. But they were willing to hear us out to start with. And then I think the process really started at the beginning of 2009, and it took about 6 months to get the utilities ready to sort of engage directly and start receiving payments, which is a fast turnaround. But we really spent a lot of time trying to understand what their biggest concerns were, and then one by one trying to alleviate them. And people who've heard me talk about this before have heard me say it was sort of a seduction of the utilities, because we really had to help them understand that this was going to be, that we were going to take care of this in a way that wasn't going to put them at risk. And a lot of that had to do with designing a very simple system for exchanging data and designing a set of operating agreements between my organization, Craft 3, Clean Energy Works Oregon, and the utilities that they were convinced after legal review really mitigated risk to them from customers not paying their loans, customers being unhappy with the retrofit or the lender. So those things are ongoing. We have an open channel with the utilities. We have assigned folks both at the billing and servicing level as well as sort of the relationship level that talk to us regularly. And we just really very much try to keep them in the tent. And then the last thing I'll say is that there was, when the utilities, when we first started this in 2009, Oregon had some pending legislation that, if passed, was going to compel the utilities to provide on-bill. So I think that helped keep them at the table. That said, the legislation that was passed was somewhat of a mishmash of a couple different bills. And to this day, I think that if the utilities wanted out of this engagement, they could probably find a way out of providing on-bill. But they've stayed in, and they understand that, you know, the success of this program, I think, has sort of put them in a position to try and continue to do this.
Mark, from my perspective, this has been a considerable effort. It's been personally
Hey, Jeff, just a sec. Can you just put yourself on mute and then take yourself off? It seems to be resolving these feedback issues.
How's that?
That is perfect.
Okay, great. This has been a considerable effort. Our legislation was enacted last August. Prior to that, there had been some proceedings underway by the Public Service Commission to evaluate and consider on-bill financing. Not surprisingly, the utilities weren't big fans. I think Governor Cuomo put this legislation through in August, and since then they have been great partners. We have a weekly call with each of the 7 utility companies, and we've really worked our way through issues, processes, systems, and I think it's been a very cooperative effort. We also were pleased that last fall, former President Bill Clinton was in Albany, New York, addressing regional economic development councils and spent a good deal of time extolling the virtues of on-bill financing. And so I think it's really gotten a fair amount of attention here within the state and certainly outside of the state. And so I think we all have been working cooperatively to make this a very successful program. And so to that end, I'd offer, happy to share whatever we've developed and learned, happy to share with all. So we certainly look forward to providing that as a resource to others who might be considering this.
Great. Thanks very much to you both. Keith, the next question's for you. It's from Peter Gutman, and he's asking, you mentioned that there are substantial rebates out there for program participants, and we're assuming that those are from third parties such as utilities. You talk about how or if you are coordinating with those existing efficiency program providers in delivering this product to consumers?
Sure. There's all the above, I guess, would be my response. There are some existing rebate programs from our electric utility here, Entergy Arkansas, that we have been using for the last few years. The utilities here in Arkansas are now under Public Service Commission mandate, kind of EERS, to reduce demand due to energy efficiency programs. So we've tapped into their existing rebate program there, but we've also jointly with our dominant gas provider here, CenterPoint Energy, we have proposed a Public Service Commission approved rebate program that is specific for our program. So we're able to really take an existing program that was existing electric program, marry it with the gas provider program, and then we've also layered in some of the ERA-funded rebate programs that our state energy office, the Arkansas Energy Office, has offered on appliance replacement and things like that. So we see ourselves as really the one-stop clearinghouse to make sense out of all this for the consumer, because they don't have the time or expertise to be able to sort through all the different rebate sources. So we think that's a real value add and a real reason for them to want to move forward with the program.
Great, thanks. And I think we'll direct this next question from Natalie Gonzalez to you, Keith, although Adam or Jeff, if you have thoughts, please jump in. But Natalie's wondering whether the retrofit costs for air sealing, duct sealing, et cetera, are negotiated in any way, or whether the participating contractors are free to offer any range of market prices that they see fit.
Well, they are free to offer market prices. However, we do counsel them on what we see are as the key drivers. Let's take air sealing, for example. In the course of our audit or in our site visit with our construction team, in context with the energy audit, excuse me, we'll count, say, roof penetrations or for insulation dam purposes, or we'll make some determination on, when it comes to ducts, on what type of interventions they're going to need in terms of amount of mastic, things like that. So we try to give them some guidelines that should narrow their ability to properly price the job. So we're not telling them what to price, but we're giving them the information that we think are key determinants on pricing. So, but they are free to submit whatever they wish, and they will, if they're the low bidder, they'll get the job. If not, it will go on to another contractor.
Great, thanks, Keith. A couple questions for Jeff and Adam about this tension around savings to investment ratios greater than 1, or delivering energy savings in excess of investment costs, and how that impacts demand, or what impact you think that might have on customer credit, and how programs and advocates and customers ultimately look at this cash flow issue.
So on the our on-bill approach, there's a requirement in statute that requires that the repayment amount can't exceed the estimated savings. So in essence, it's requiring positive cash flow. However, the standards that we've set for our direct unsecured loan don't require positive cash flow. We currently have a program standard that requires a savings to investment ratio greater than 1. We are going to be modifying that standard within the next few days to go to more of a bit more of a cash flow standard, but it will be viewed from the cash flow of the consumer. We have had instances where some consumers don't want to have a longer repayment term, and so a consumer who might elect a shorter repayment term and knowingly not have positive cash flow during the repayment period, but then still realize savings once their obligation's paid off, that's not allowed in on-bill, but we think should be allowed in our direct financing option. And so we're tweaking our standards to modify what those requirements are.
I would just add that, as many of you probably know, savings to investment ratios are usually accurate by 25% either way, and that's not talking about what people behaviorally tend to do after their homes get more efficient. There can be rebound effects where people who weren't heating rooms previously because half the heat was going out a drafty window or something else, now are heating a room. So they end up actually spending more money on their bill. They're just using those dollars more efficiently. So that's something that I think is going to be maybe solved over time with better monitoring, better metering, things like that. But it's tough to overcome. The second thing is that we are pretty convinced that the sales mechanism here, some of it's cash flow based, but a lot of it is about comfort, value for your money, improving your real estate, and those are all aspects that people choose to spend money on that could go above and beyond a simple payback. And we think that these programs really ought to embrace those sales techniques and those values that people put on their homes, because people make decisions for a whole variety of reasons. And frankly, good salespeople in the contracting world, really the home performance contracting world that are on the front lines of this, are selling those things out the gate. They're selling warm seats and cozy kids and all that good stuff that makes you feel like it's something worth investing in. And I think if you ask the contractors that have been doing this for a while, they will say that that's their lead in sales. And so I think that's stuff that's important to consider. And then finally, like I expressed before, it's tough to get a really high-performing SIR in climates where energy costs and weather don't create a really good scenario.
Great. Thanks very much, Adam. Okay, folks, if you've got... Oops, sorry, hang on one second. Okay, folks, on that note, now I'm back. So one last question for you, Adam, and folks, if you've got questions that haven't yet been answered, this is your last chance to submit them. Adam, for in a post-Recovery Act world, for folks across the country that are trying to find ways to work with CDFIs, do you have specific advice for them as they think about how to engage those kind of socially driven financial institutions?
Well, it's tough. I mean, we helped capitalize and kick off this effort with Recovery Act money, and have since sourced below market rate debt from foundations and banks that are interested in sort of the outcomes of what we're doing. I continue to believe that as a CDFI, our job in this market is to find the edge and push it, and hopefully prove success in such a way that brings more capital-rich, liquid depository institutions in behind us with products that serve the market. CDFIs in large part are designed to experiment, and then if we do our jobs really well, sort of conventional markets come in and steal our customers, and we're just okay with that, because that means we can go on and do the next thing. So I think to give CDFIs comfort to come into this, policymakers at the state level and at the federal level need to find ways to provide initial cash and tie that to sort of types of performance that they want to see, and then allow experimentation and market development to happen. And our concern, of course, as I finished with my presentation, was we're building this portfolio, but we are going to need to sell it. And so, again, we need to find investors that are sort of ready to take the next step and are thinking about a long-term engagement in this market. So I don't have a simple or easy answer to how to attract folks into this. I will also say that the changes in mortgage lending law that have happened over the last 4 years, thanks to some of the very reckless things that were done, have made this kind of lending harder. The unfortunate thing is, we feel like a good guy trying to do the right thing, but we're complying with laws that are really designed to keep bad actors on the sidelines, and that has added cost and time to what we're doing. I think it might be interesting to think about what CDFIs can do in terms of consumer lending and maybe providing them a niche that isn't quite so heavily regulated as is consumer lending from the depository side now. That's just off the top of my head.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Oh, goodness. Thank you all so much. At this point, I think we're going to close the webinar, especially since nobody can hear me. To Jeff, Adam, and Keith, thank you all so much. Your expertise is very much valued, and I think everybody took a lot from today's webinar. Thanks very much for joining us all.